All right. Welcome to Sideboard MTG. My name's Eric, and today's January 15th, 2018. And we got a banned and restricted announcement from Wizards, and it actually had some cards in it this time. 4 cards were banned, and we have got to talk about this because they are 4 cards from the 2 top tier decks in Ixalan. So, are those decks going to be booted from Rivals of Ixalan? Well, I don't know, but we're going to talk about it and we'll see how the meta unfolds. As always, like the channel if you like it, subscribe, all the other good YouTube things, share, you know what to do. Let's jump straight into this article by Ian Duke here. Now, if you want to look at the article, there's a link to it in the description box below, but I'm just going to kind of talk about it a little bit here and talk about some of the things that Wizards done, and I want to point out some things that Wizards said or Ian said here in the article. So like to shine a little bit of light on the situation. I know some of you guys, you really are upset that Teamer has been hurt yet again. The deck has been around for quite some time in many different shells and seems to just about always receive some type of ban. However, this time they no longer went after the win cons of the Teamer package. They actually just went after the package itself, dealing with energy, right off the bat, just dealing with the production cards. So the number 1 card to be banned here, the very first one, probably got a lot to do with alphabetical order, but it's Attune with Aether. Now, this card doesn't need an explanation. Anyone who has played Standard knows all 4 of these cards, so we don't have to actually break down what the cards do. But for just a side note, this was an enabler that allowed the decks to run, 56 card decks, allowed them to run less lands than normal, thin their decks, gain extra energy, and it just really helped with that energy production, allowing cards like Bristling Hydra and stuff like that to be protected the moment they come down, almost shutting off interaction. And the same can be said for Rogue Refiner, coming out on a very nice curve, a good body, good beater, just giving you that extra energy, replacing itself, things of that nature. Now, are we done seeing cards like Rogue Refiner in Standard? No, they just printed a 2-mana black vampire that when it enters the battlefield, you lose a life and draw a card. That's pretty good. That's not a bad card at all, and that will replace itself. There's also the new Blue Merfolk, so you can, well, I say new, but new to Standard. You can play it, draw a card off of it. So we're going to see this interaction, but not having the additional energy coming off of it's going to be a lot to do with why this card was chosen. And then Rampaging Ferocidon, I think that this particular card was chosen mainly because of it disabled other decks. So every time that there was a deck that would rise up to fight Teamer Energy or have some type of answer for Teamer Energy, it would be oppressed by Rampaging Ferocidon. Now, even though Rampaging Ferocidon was probably introduced to help deal with other strategies and things like that to keep other strategies from being too dominant, it held those strategies down to the point where they could not come up and healthily defeat Teamer Energy. So, Rampaging Ferocidon definitely made the list here, and I kind of hate to see it go, but it does stop a combo that I'm particularly fond of playing with. So, adios. And then the Reach card for Red deck. Ramunap Ruins is basically widely known as the card that enabled Red deck, that gave Red deck the reach it needed to avoid, say, a control deck stabilizing at 2 or 4, giving them the ability to just ping that little extra bit. That has made a lot of changes. With this being gone, there's going to be other things that Red deck will have to do to be able to get away with getting that extra damage, but I don't necessarily think that Red deck is completely hurt. I do think that it'll shift into white now, but there is another effect. So this sacrifice a land, deal 2 damage to the opponent thing is not completely going for red deck. However, I just don't think it'll be a mono red deck anymore. And I've even pulled up an example here to show you guys what I'm talking about. This deck recently 5-0'd. I just pulled the 3 decks that I'm going to use for examples today from the recent 5-0 list on Magic or magic.tcg.player, or sorry, magic.tcgplayer.com. Just the very first competitive list here. I grabbed the Teamer Energy, what says red deck, but it's got a white symbol in it, and I was very curious about that. And then I grabbed just the standard mono red, single mono red deck. And let's look at those really quick before we go much farther into Ian Duke's article. Now, if you pull up just the standard mono red deck, you'll see that main board there were 4 copies of Rampaging Ferocidon, and there were 4 copies of Ramunap Ruins main board. Now, you'll also see a number of other deserts in the deck, and the whole purpose of those deserts is to help better enable Ramunap Ruins. So it was very prevalent in the red deck. So this is 8 cards that are completely banned out of the red deck. And let's go ahead and look at that. What I was saying might be a viable answer. With Rampaging Ferocidon missing out of the main board, this particular player has chosen to go with a little bit more pirates, but he's also running what could be a fairly suitable dinosaur to replace Rampaging Ferocidon. It's Vigilance, not Menace, but 2 mana for a 3/3. And if you are a red deck, you may not be that worried about the downside to this, as it will be a blocker and it will be an attacker to help push damage. Now, in the real change here, so I don't think that card will replace Rampaging Ferocidon, but I do think that Path of Metal here could possibly replace, how do I flip this? Wow, okay, well, alright, so Path of Metal, the backside of this card, how do we flip this? That's bad. Alright, well, Path of Metal has an ability on it. You just pay 3 mana and tap it, and you can deal 2 damage to each opponent. Or you can actually make them sacrifice a random attacking creature. So there's definitely some reach still available for the red decks. They may have to splash white to get it, but I do believe that the red decks can cast Path of Metal better than some of the other versions, because they have so many cards with haste and things like that. So this deck did 5-0, so there's definitely options for you red deck players. A lot of people have been wanting to see a white splash in some of these red decks anyway for a couple of the other cards. It may not be Relentless Raptor that you want, but then again it might be. I don't think that they're just looking for a 3/3 body to replace the Rampaging Ferocidon. I think it was more of the effect and the stopping the opponent from being able to heal. I think that was more of what red deck had, and unfortunately, it was just very usable in other strategies to help oppress the meta. So I think that's why Rampaging Ferocidon was taken out. Let's go ahead and look at the Teamer Energy deck. Now, this is just a generic Teamer Energy deck. Does have a couple of Viziers and things. Nothing that we're not used to seeing. But, of course, you're going to see that 4 copies of Rogue Refiner, and you're going to see the 4 copies of Attune with Aether. And then you only have 22 other lands, and that's kind of one of the things about it. So if Attune with Aether is an honorary land, then this is a 26 land mid-range deck. That's not completely unheard of, but it's not going to be happening anymore with Attune of Aether gone. So let's go back over to the banned announcement here. Now, one of the things that Wizards talked about here, they talked about, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, I'll just kind of paraphrase some things, but there's one line in here that was put that I really, really thank Wizards for putting. This is in despite of the best efforts of the metagame to adapt and counter these decks. Now, they spoke about it being 40% of the meta between Energy and Ramunap Ruins, or sorry, Ramunap Red. So that means that there was 60% of the meta, 60% of people, of deck builders, of people just like me and you and everyone that builds decks to try to fight back, 40% of the meta could not be stopped, basically, by the other 60% trying. So either it was a combination of the two, oppressing other decks. If you built a deck that could beat one, you just instantly lost to the other. So you had a 40% chance of just losing if you come up against these decks, and that well, not necessarily a 40% chance of losing, but that I was just really happy that they acknowledged that the other 60% was giving effort to really try to fight and to push these decks back. Everyone was building decks to the point where it was almost discouraging. So next they do talk about that the fact that best decks are always common in the standard environment. You're always going to have what we call in standard the solving of the meta. After cards have been out for a little while and people start to find better combinations that work together, yeah, there'll always be slight innovations and things like that. But for the most part, you'll find that there's always a few best decks or top tier decks in a standard environment. Now, the three things that they looked at here was the length of time in which a deck was dominant, and they said for as long as 5 months or more, depending on how you categorize the different energy variants. And then one of the other things was that the standard rotation didn't meaningfully produce decks that could compete with them. And then the last thing was, despite the metagame having many months to adapt to those decks and counterplay options, they just didn't prove sufficient. Cards like Solemnity, they were printed, and to help, but they were just not sufficient enough to fight back cards like Teamer. And I'm not going to comment on what could have been changed. I've mentioned that in the past, some cards that I think could have helped fight against Teamer and that would have been sufficient. But that is the past, and that is not where we stand right now. Where we stand now is looking at why these were chosen. And if you look at the rest of the article, they'll go down and they'll talk about the different variants of energy and their matchups and the percentages that those decks would win in their testing and when they pulled data. So there's some really good data here if you want to look at the crunched numbers and things like that. I do want to talk about what the three things they mentioned here. So it says when examining candidates for banning, the three things that they look at the most. Now, one is to reduce the overall win percentage of Teamer energy and other energy variants while still preserving the competitive compatibility of the core of the deck. Now, what does that mean? Wow, okay, so it's a mouthful, but for the most part, it just means they wanted to ban some things without breaking the concept of energy. They didn't want to just break the deck altogether and say, now Teamer energy is completely non-viable. And you've heard a lot of people talking about it. I've been in a lot of different live chats and things this morning, and I've spoken to a lot of different people. Ryan from Behind Eyes Gaming. I was listening to, Top Level Podcast and a few other things. I was even popped my head in MTGO Traders this morning, was listening while they were talking a little bit about it. But everyone has had their ideas on, is Teamer broken now? And a lot of people say that they don't actually believe the deck's broken. It will probably no longer have the inevitability that it had before, but for the most part the deck is not broken, and I think that it will continue to adapt. It just maybe not be the oppressive deck that it has been in the past. Now, the second thing here is they wanted to look at open space in the metagame for other decks to excel above energy in certain areas, but force energy decks to build towards different strengths and weaknesses. Now, yeah, okay, so they wanted to just basically open things up, but make energy not just run these cards that allowed them to virtually run 56 or even 52 card decks. You're just instantly replacing your cards, and you're running the exact same strategy, and it builds for a really good curve, and that was one of the things that made Teamer energy extremely strong. So the next thing here is to allow for easier counterplay against energy decks. Now, if I read this correctly, with banning Attune and Rogue Refiner to allow with easier counterplay against energy decks, to me this just screams, but I can't kill Hydra if they already have 3 energy by turn 4. That's what it screams. It screams I can't kill Hydra, or they get too much value out of a Whirler or Virtuoso. So, like, I need to be able to respond to these in response to their own energy trigger. Even though it's going to create this little window and I have to respond in that little window, with Attune and Rogue Refiner being gone, it's going to open up those small windows. And as long as you're holding the right card at the right moment, you're going to be able to answer cards like Bristling Hydra and things like that, because they're not going to have that energy stockpile before they can play them. Or they're going to have to play them later after they've gained energy from other means, or it will make you have to play smarter and have bigger bodies so they can't gain extra energy from harness lightnings and things of that nature. So it's going to allow us to build around and to start playing with different interactions, but for no means do I think that teamer energy is gone. And then the last thing here is they wanted to preserve the most fun gameplay and deck building elements while reducing the frustrating ones. You know what? You definitely have to get behind that. The rest of the article goes into exactly why they chose the cards they did, and a lot of it is along the lines of what I just mentioned. You know, they did mention Long Tusk Cub and how Attune can make a Long Tusk Cub more powerful on turn 2 and things like that, and it gives you another interaction. And I'll leave their interactions from there. That's why I wanted to use the Bristling Hydra comment. But if you look at the rest of the article, they basically just go down and talk about why, you know, each of these cards interacted and what made each of these cards so strong with each other. And they definitely break down the percentages and the win rate against certain matchups. And when you look at them, you know, they're just barely over 50%. 60% win rate against other matches is not that great. So, you know, it wasn't just a matter of, you know, teamer energy and red deck being so oppressive, but it was a matter of how much they were getting run, that people had basically just taken to the net deck strategy and was putting so much of it into the format that we were just seeing nonstop, you know, top 8s of this. So I believe that that is some of the reasons that, you know, Attune and Rogue Refiner were banned. Now let's talk a little bit about red deck real quick and talk about why Rampaging Ferocidon was banned. And I think for the most part, we're just going to keep landing on the fact that it oppressed the decks that were someone just subscribed. That's great. Thanks for subscribing, whoever you are. I don't have my alerts up on this particular video. However, we're going to talk about Rampaging Ferocidon. It definitely held down the other decks and oppressed those decks, so it kept you from being able to fight. But one of the big things that kind of caught everyone off of guard this morning was the fact that red deck was targeted at all. And that, in my opinion, is because if you did do damage to the teamer deck, the teamer deck was the only thing that oppressed the red deck, and the red deck was the only thing that oppressed the teamer deck. So if you did damage to the teamer deck, red deck would completely take over, or at least in, you know, in accordance to a lot of people, that the numbers below don't necessarily show that red deck would completely take over, but it would have favorable matchups. It would always at least have a 50% matchup on average against just about any deck. And, you know, basically sitting down in front of red deck and flipping a coin going heads or tails. All right, well, let's save an hour here. And that's not really where you want to be. I mean, you always have your gameplay and you can always answer it, but with red deck being as powerful as it is, it's definitely going to make red deck have to shift things up and find other ways to get that additional reach. Plus, if you have cards like Ramunap Ruins and Path of Metal in the same meta, then that would give red deck a ton of reach. Being able to flip a Path of Metal by turn 3 is a little bit, worrisome. You can play a haste creature on 1, play another haste creature on 2, play path metal on 3, swing, or even vigilance, menace, any of those. It's very easy to flip the card. So the reach is going to be there, and having Ramunap Ruins and this reach, I think it would have just been a little too much. So that was the band announcement, guys, and I think that we're going to be in a much healthier environment going from here forward. I think that, you know, banning some cards out of the energy production for Attune with Aether and Rogue Refiner for the Teamer deck. I think that's the right route to go, and then making sure that red deck can't just completely take over by eliminating the Ramunap Ruins. I think the Ramunap Ruins was the real hit on red deck to make sure that they couldn't just completely take over. I think Rampaging Ferocidon was more of a meta call because it could oppress so much. This was a 100% oppressive card and shut down entire strategies because of its existence. Rampaging Ferocidon might have been a little bit too powerful of a card for standard. I don't think that the card's completely gone forever. I think that it'll see some play in modern and some things like that, eventually, at least, if it's not already. So I like what happened, and I think that we've got a healthy spot going forward. If nothing else, this is going to allow the tribal decks a chance to thrive in a fresh meta, and it may create a gap where it takes a little bit longer for us to solve the meta because so much has been shifted. Even though this being a mid set, we're still going to have such a huge shift in the meta that we've basically got a brand new entire block. It's almost as if things rotated out because we just had major hits to our top decks. But that's all I've got to say about the band announcement. It's probably already been 20-25 minutes. So guys, it was great. I look forward to seeing your new builds. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you had fun. We'll see you next time here on the sideboard.